So, hi everyone, we're George and Pauline, and at UTS, we coordinate the teaching method subjects for science and maths. And today we're going to be talking about teaching strategies and what this means for all of us in our different disciplines. So, George, why don't you talk to us about what you think a teaching strategy is?
Okay, thank you, Pauline, and good morning, everyone. Now, in terms of where do you start? When we start talking about this idea of teaching strategies, where do you start? I mean, there are hundreds of different strategies that we as teachers employ in the classroom. In this presentation, we'll try and briefly give a description of one or two strategies. But what we will more focus on are some critical aspects to consider in relation to your teaching strategies. Obviously, the students will discuss and engage with specific strategies in their respective method subjects. So if we start by having a look at the slide that's in front of us, and this is from the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, the domain that we're looking at with this specific strategy is the professional practice. And more specifically, we're looking at 3.3, which is include a range of teaching strategies. So let's try and unpack this for you a little bit. Thanks, Pauline.
Okay, so we've got here a list that you've put together about what comes to mind for you when you think about teaching strategies. So let's start with number one, teaching and learning.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Pauline. And look, Pauline and I have had a chat just leading up to this session as well. And what we tried to write down, if you like, and as an overview for the next 3 or 4 weeks where we will really engage with teaching strategies in our respective disciplines, teaching methods, we tried to sort of come up with 3 or 4 key areas that we wanted just to say a couple of things on. And the first one is, you really can't talk about teaching in isolation. For both of us and for many, you know, if you're talking about teaching, you really must be talking about learning almost in the same breath, in the same sentence. But I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly.
Basically, it doesn't make sense to talk about one without the other.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I might even talk about, you know, some would argue that learning should precede the teaching, but we'll come to that in a moment or two. Talking about teaching strategies, different, you know, the range of teaching strategies, you really need to go back to the fundamental core question is, who is our audience? And obviously as teachers, it is our students. And we need to know something about them. But more specifically, in relation to teaching strategies, how do they learn? And we'll talk about that in a minute. And the way they learn will dictate what we do in terms of those strategies we employ in the classroom. I also wouldn't mind saying a couple of words in terms of getting the right balance between teaching and learning. And, you know, many, many years ago when I was a student, most of my teachers would stand at the front and pretty much talk for the entire session. We hear today quite a bit about student-centered learning. And I'd like to say a couple of things in terms of, you know, what is the balance? Is there a right balance between teaching and between learning? And I'd like to say at this early stage that at the end of the day, we are teaching and we are learning for the duration of the lesson. Teaching is not just standing at the front and giving some explicit instruction for 10 minutes and then handing it over to the students. While the students are working, whether independently or in groups, we are engaging, we are still teaching.
Actually, I'd argue we're still learning.
Absolutely. And the students are learning when we're teaching. And then I'd like to talk finally a little bit about multiple strategies or activities, if you like, within a lesson and the importance of that. And, you know, you might go into a lesson where you're only going to do one thing. For example, an experiment, which will take 60 minutes to complete. Can we give some thought to, can we break that experiment down into maybe subcomponents, into 3 different areas? And then within those subcomponents, can that be broken down even further? And the more we do and engage with that, the more we're helping our learners engage and understand in terms of what it is that we're trying to take away from that. And Pauline, did you want to say something about the spontaneous point there on this slide?
Yes, well, actually, what I find is that I really struggle with the idea of just talking about teaching strategies as a general thing, because if you ask me about teaching strategies, I wouldn't know where to start, because I could tell you about strategies that I use for trigonometry or place value or something like this, but they're really different. And so some of the strategies that I find myself using are very context specific. So we might get into that in a bit.
Okay. So just unpacking these 4 areas a little bit further, let's have a look at this first one where I said you almost need to use teaching and learning in the same sentence. And they really do go hand in hand, and you almost can't talk about one without talking about the other. They are synonymous. When we talk about teaching, we think about the learning, and when we're looking at the learning, we're really looking to see what we're doing in terms of our teaching. They should occur concurrently, and that should be done throughout the lesson. You know, you're teaching, they're learning, you're still walking around and engaging and teaching, amending, correcting. And that is done throughout the lesson. You know, sometimes we might think that once we see teaching, or explicit teaching for that matter, we might give some instructions at the start. And then again, we hand it over to the students. But we are still teaching while the students are working independently. We are still teaching while the students are working in groups. And while the students are working in groups or independently, they are still learning from us. We are still teaching, not just those couple of minutes at the beginning of the lesson or the conclusion of the lesson when we're summing up the idea. So the teaching and learning should be concurrent, and it's throughout, obviously, the duration of the lesson. This next point here in terms of teaching and learning that we'd like you to give some thought to, many teachers would take the approach where they would do the teaching at the beginning of the lesson and then they will hand it over to the students. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But what about considering where we might do it in reverse order? Get the students to engage, to learn for themselves, and then we extract some meaning for them at the end. But again, just going back to a point I made earlier, teaching and learning should be concurrent and throughout the lesson. I think we've got to be careful, and as a word of caution, that we don't sort of assign parts of a lesson where we talk, parts of a lesson where they do. Not that we're not saying you don't do that, but really at any point in time, there should be the two happening simultaneously. In relation to learning, a key question is, who are our learners? And if we really don't understand who is our audience, what are their strengths, and more importantly, what are their weaknesses, we really can't do justice to this process of learning. So there's a critical question here. How can we get to know our learners? And once you get to know our learners, or once we know more about them, that will actually go a long way to dictating our teaching and learning strategies that will ultimately be the most efficient and the most effective in terms of what we're trying to achieve in the classroom environment.
So here, we've got some imagery to help us to unpack some of these ideas. George, I think I might get you to talk about this too, actually, about what's going on in these pictures.
Yep. And look, I think students can actually look at that and, you know, understand straight away what the message we're trying to sell here. And, you know, teaching is not unique in terms of understanding the source, what it is that we're trying to address. And I draw on an example here of the doctor examining a patient. And obviously, before the doctor prescribes the medication or any further assessments, the doctor, he or she, will need to do an examination. They're getting to understand the nature of the problem that the patient is experiencing. Similarly, for the case of the mechanic, you know, we often take our car to be serviced, But before the mechanic can actually commence with the servicing of the car, he or she will need to understand what is going on.
Actually, there's a way of thinking about this, I suppose, as teaching and assessment go together just as much as teaching and learning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are so many situations in the world around us where to actually address the problem and do it efficiently and effectively, we must first understand the source. And in our profession, in the teaching profession, the critical source here is our students. And if we don't take the time to understand our students, understand their learning strengths, but more importantly, their weaknesses, we really may not be able to deliver the quality education that we intend to do.